The morning Ethan Parker turned 38, he woke up to the sound of nothing. No alarm, no phone buzzing with birthday messages, no small feet padding down the hallway the way they used to when his daughter was still young enough to think that birthdays were a reason for pancakes with too much syrup and hand-drawn cards left on kitchen counters. Those days felt like a different life now. They belonged to a version of him that had lived in a house with a backyard and a mortgage and the comfortable weight of ordinary routine. A version that had not yet decided to risk everything on an idea sketched out on the back of a grocery receipt. What he had instead was the flat gray light coming through curtains he hadn't opened in 3 days. A half-empty coffee mug sitting cold on his nightstand. And the low, crawling dread of a man who already knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this particular day was going to demand something from him that he wasn't sure he had left to give. He lay there for a while, not sleeping, not really thinking, just existing in that strange suspended space between knowing he needed to get up and finding a single reason compelling enough to do it. Eventually, the reason arrived the same way it always did, not inspiration, not hope, but obligation. He had a meeting, the most important meeting of the last 2 years of his life, and he was already running late. Ethan had built Green Axis Technologies from a single idea sketched out on the back of a grocery receipt 3 years ago. The idea was not complicated, and that was part of what he loved about it. A modular, scalable system for capturing and redistributing waste heat from industrial facilities into usable clean energy for surrounding neighborhoods. Not a moonshot, not science fiction. Something real, something practical, something that could work right now if someone would just give it a chance to breathe. He had spent the first year refining the technology. He had spent the second year trying to get someone, anyone, to believe in it enough to write a check. He had sold his house during that second year, not because the company forced him to, but because he could not bring himself to lay off his 7-person team when he knew the technology was sound and the only thing missing was capital. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. He took the smallest salary on his own payroll, less than what his junior developer was making. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things during that period, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in the morning, coaching himself through another day of waiting, pitching, and being told no. The potential deal with Titan Global had arrived like a lifeline dropped into dark water. Titan was not just a large investment firm. It was the firm, the kind of institutional player whose endorsement turned skeptics into believers and opened doors that had previously been sealed shut. $10 million. That was the number on the table. Or at least the number Ethan had been told was theoretically possible if the pitch landed correctly. $10 million would not just save Green Axis. It would transform it, give it the runway to move from prototype to full-scale deployment, to hire the engineering team they needed, to begin the rollout across 3 states that Ethan had been mapping out on his laptop screen during late nights, when the rest of the apartment was dark and quiet, and the numbers either made sense or they didn't. He had prepared for this pitch the way a person prepares for something they know might not come again. Every slide refined, every projection double-checked, every potential objection anticipated and answered. He had practiced in front of the mirror, in front of his phone camera, in front of anyone on his team willing to sit through another run-through. He had been ready. He had believed, genuinely believed, that if he could just get in the room and make his case, the rest would follow. The pitch lasted 11 minutes before it ended, not because he had run out of things to say, but because the woman sitting at the head of the Titan Global conference table, a woman he had been told in advance was one of the senior decision-makers, someone whose name he had been given as Victoria Hayes, had raised one hand, so slightly it barely registered as a gesture, and the room had gone quiet. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with the kind of composed, unreadable expression that comes not from coldness, but from having learned, over many years, to make very few movements that she did not intend. She had not looked at him with cruelty. That was what he would remember later, in the worst moments of the weeks that followed. She had not looked at him with dismissal or contempt. She had looked at him the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, clinically, carefully, already knowing what she was going to say before she said it. "Mr. Parker," she said, and her voice was measured and calm. "The concept you're presenting is genuinely interesting. The underlying technology has merit. I'm not disputing that. A pause. The kind of pause that always comes before something you don't want to hear. But I have serious reservations about execution. About whether your team, at your current scale, with your current resources, has the infrastructure to actually deliver this at the level the concept demands. I'm not investing in an idea, Mr. Parker. I'm investing in a team's ability to turn that idea into reality. And I'm not convinced yours can. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, found words and lost them. He thanked the room. He collected his materials. He walked out into the hallway, then into the elevator, then out through the marble lobby of the Titan Global building and onto the sidewalk, where the afternoon traffic was moving past him in both directions as though nothing had changed, because for everyone else in the world, nothing had. He stood there for a moment with his briefcase in his hand and the October air hitting his face, and he tried to locate inside himself the appropriate emotional response to what had just happened. What he found instead was a kind of numbness, the quiet that comes after something large has broken. He had been bracing for this possibility for months. He had run the numbers, considered the scenarios, tried to prepare himself. But preparation is not the same as experience. And experience, in this case, was the understanding that the last 2 years of his life, the house, the salary, the endless pitching, the belief he had maintained through every rejection that this time might be different, had just been evaluated in 11 minutes and found insufficient. He started walking. Not toward anything in particular. Just walking. Because standing still felt worse. And because somewhere in the distance, there was still an afternoon to get through. And then an evening, and then his birthday, which was today, a fact that felt almost absurdly irrelevant in the context of everything else, and yet somehow, stupidly, still managed to register somewhere in the part of him that remembered what it used to feel like to mark the passage of years with something more than this. He passed 3 blocks before he noticed the bakery. It was a small place, the kind that exists in the middle of the city without much fanfare. A hand-painted sign above the door, warm light coming through the window, the smell of butter and vanilla reaching him even on the sidewalk. The sign said Sullivan's, in hand-lettered green paint that had begun to flake at the edges, and there was a small chalkboard propped outside listing the day's specials in someone's imprecise cursive. He had walked past it before, or he thought he had, though he could not have said with certainty. It was the kind of place you don't notice until the day you need exactly what it offers, which in his case was not a particular pastry but simply warmth, and the temporary suspension of his own circumstances. He had not been planning to stop anywhere. He had not been planning anything, but he pushed open the door and stepped inside because it was warm and quiet, and for a moment, he did not have to be a founder, or a failure, or a man whose idea had just been rejected for the 5th time in 18 months. He was just a person who had come in out of the cold. The display case was full of cakes and pastries in various sizes and stages of decoration. He looked at the prices. He opened his wallet and looked at what he had left in it after the transportation and the parking and the coffee he had bought himself that morning as a small act of optimism before the pitch. $3. There was a cupcake near the front of the case that was $3.25. He stood there for a moment doing the arithmetic with the kind of tired mental energy that comes at the end of a very long day. He was short 25 cents. He almost laughed. He almost turned around and left. That was when he noticed her. She was standing a few feet away at the counter. A woman somewhere in her mid-40s, wearing a plain dark coat and carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. Her hair pulled back simply, her appearance so unremarkable in every deliberate way that if he had passed her on the street, he would not have given her a second look. She was talking with the young woman behind the counter in a low, slightly strained voice. The conversation was brief. The woman in the coat was trying to buy a birthday cake, a small one, decorated with yellow flowers, sitting in a white box on the counter in front of her for her mother. She was $13 short of the price. She had been looking through her bag, then through her coat pockets, with the particular expression of someone who is embarrassed and trying not to show it, that quiet, private mortification of being caught underprepared in a moment that should have been simple. "I'm so sorry," she said to the clerk. "I could come back tomorrow." But the woman behind the counter said gently that the cake had been special ordered and was already paid for in part, and it would go stale by tomorrow, and she was sorry too, but she didn't know what else she could do. The woman in the coat nodded. She stood very still for a moment, and then she reached into her bag again. Methodically, the way people do when they already know what they're going to find, but feel compelled to look one more time anyway. Ethan did not think about it. That was the part that he would try to explain later and find difficult to articulate. There was no calculation, no weighing of circumstances, no moment of deciding. He simply reached into his wallet, took out the $3, and placed them on the counter. "Please add that," he said to the clerk. The woman in the coat turned and looked at him. Up close, she had a still, direct quality to her gaze that he registered briefly and then set aside. "You don't have to do that," she said. Her voice was careful and quiet. "No," Ethan agreed. "But today is my birthday. And I didn't have any other plans for this money." He said it lightly, meaning to make a small joke of it, to give her an out from the awkwardness of being helped by a stranger. She did not laugh, exactly, but something in her expression shifted, a slight softening around the eyes, a kind of attention. The clerk completed the transaction. The woman in the coat picked up the box carefully, both hands, the way you carry something that matters. She stood for a moment and looked at him. "Your birthday," she said, "and you're spending it here, paying for someone else's cake. It's a very small amount," he said. $3. "That's not the point," she said. They stood in the narrow warmth of the bakery for another few minutes. He told her, briefly, that it had been a difficult day. He did not explain further. She did not ask him to. She said that her mother had been in the hospital recently and was finally well enough to come home, and that the cake had been something she had promised weeks ago, during one of those bedside conversations you have when you're trying to project normalcy into a situation that has very little. She said she had miscounted the cash in her wallet because she'd been distracted all day, and she'd felt ridiculous standing at that counter. "I was about to leave without it," she said. "The look on my mother's face would have been—" She paused. "It would have been fine." She would have said it was fine, but it wouldn't have been. Not really. Ethan understood that completely. He said so. They were quiet for a moment. She looked at him carefully. "Do you believe that kindness comes back around?" she asked. Not rhetorically. As though she genuinely wanted to know. He thought about it honestly, standing there with his briefcase and his empty wallet, and the specific weight of a day that had taken almost everything he had. "I'm not sure," he said. "I've seen enough to make me skeptical, but I haven't given up on the idea." She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, once, as though he had said something that registered with her in a way she hadn't expected. She thanked him. She picked up the box and left. He stood at the counter and bought nothing, because he had nothing left to buy anything with, and then he walked home in the dark. The email arrived at 7:43 the following morning. Ethan was still in the clothes he had fallen asleep in, sitting at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, staring at a spreadsheet that continued to tell him the same thing it had been telling him for weeks. The sender was a name he recognized from Titan Global's communications team, an assistant whose name he had seen on previous correspondence. The subject line said only, "Follow-up meeting request, Green Axis Technologies." He read it 3 times before he allowed himself to interpret it as real. The message was brief. Victoria Hayes was requesting a second meeting, this afternoon, if he was available, 2 o'clock. "The same building," he replied immediately, before he could talk himself into caution, and then he sat very still for a moment and did not permit himself to feel anything definitive about it. He had been disappointed too many times to spend emotional energy on anticipation before he understood what he was walking into. He changed his clothes. He reviewed his materials. He told himself it was probably a courtesy meeting, a chance for them to explain their position more thoroughly, or to refer him to a smaller fund, or to close the door cleanly. He took the elevator to Titan Global's floor, nodded to the same receptionist from the day before, and was escorted down the same hallway to the same conference room. The door opened. He walked in. She was sitting at the head of the table, exactly as she had been the day before, wearing a different suit but carrying the same composed, still quality, and she turned when he entered and looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read. He took his seat across from her, said good afternoon, and then he registered what he was actually seeing. Not the professional composure, not the tailored suit, not the executive presence, but the face itself, the line of the jaw, the particular stillness of the eyes. The plain dark coat had been replaced by something considerably more formal. The canvas bag was gone. The casual simplicity of the previous evening was nowhere in evidence, but it was the same face, the same direct attention. He understood it in the way you understand something that your mind has been unwilling to accept all at once, and with no comfortable place to put the realization. She watched him process it. She did not look away. "You recognize me," she said. It was not a question. He did not say anything for a moment. Then, "You were in the bakery." "Yes." Another pause. "You're Victoria Hayes." "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. The woman at the counter with the canvas bag and the birthday cake for her mother. The woman who had looked at him with that particular attention and asked him whether he believed kindness came back around. The same woman who had sat in this room the day before and told him she didn't believe his team could execute. He looked at her. "I don't understand what's happening," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I'll explain." Victoria Hayes had been doing what she called observation walks for the better part of a decade. It had started, she told him, during a period early in her career when she'd begun to notice something that bothered her about the way people behaved around power. The same individuals who were dismissive or indifferent to her in ordinary settings became solicitous and warm the moment they learned her name, her title, her position in the hierarchy of things. It was not a surprise, exactly. She had understood intellectually that status changed how people were treated long before she'd experienced it firsthand. But living it, repeatedly, in small ways and large ones, had done something to her. Perception had made her start to wonder how much of what she saw in professional settings was genuine, and how much was performance calibrated to the audience. And so, periodically, she went to ordinary places. Grocery stores, coffee shops, transit platforms. Once, a laundromat in the outer part of the city where nobody knew her face. She went without the suits and the assistants and the professional context that marked her as someone worth impressing. She went as a person, just a person, and she watched how other people behaved when there was nothing to be gained from behaving well. She told Ethan this steadily, without drama, watching his face as she spoke. The previous evening, she explained, had not been orchestrated specifically for him. She had not known she would encounter anyone from the prior day's meetings. She had simply wanted, as she often did when the day had been heavy, to step outside of her own context for an hour. Her mother really had been in the hospital. The birthday cake was real. The shortage of cash, a result of having emptied her wallet earlier that day for a donation she had made in cash at a community fundraiser, was real. She had stood at that counter and felt the genuine discomfort of being unable to complete a simple purchase, and she had turned, and he had been there. She paused. She looked at him with that same direct, measuring attention. "You had no idea who I was," she said. "None," he confirmed. "You'd just come out of a meeting where I'd rejected your project. You were carrying, I could see it, you were carrying a very difficult day. You had $3 in your wallet. And instead of keeping them, you gave them to a stranger so her mother could have a birthday cake." Ethan looked at the table, then back at her. "It was $3, he said. "I know what it was," she said. "I also know what it cost you. Not financially. The other thing." He did not say anything. She went on. "I've been in rooms with a lot of people over the years, Mr. Parker. I've sat across from extraordinary people, brilliant people, driven people, people with more talent and more resources than almost anyone I know, and I've watched many of them, The moment something doesn't go their way, become very small, very hard. The generosity disappears. What's left is whatever was always underneath it. You walked out of a rejection yesterday, and your first impulse was to help someone you'd never met. Not because it benefited you, not because anyone was watching, because it was the right thing to do. Another pause. Her voice was level, not sentimental. She was simply stating what she had observed, with the same precision she applied to everything. That tells me something about who you actually are when no one is looking. And that, she said, is the only thing I trust completely. Then she looked at him and said, I want you to tell me about your project again, from the beginning. What Victoria had been doing in the days between the first pitch and this conversation was not merely reflecting on a moment of personal generosity. She was thorough. That was one of the things that people who worked closely with her tended to say, that her instincts were unusually reliable, not because they were mystical, but because they were always backed by due diligence of a kind that left very little to chance. She had assigned a member of her research team the task of reviewing Green Axis Technologies in full, not the abbreviated packet that had been prepared for the initial pitch, but everything. Tax records, employee records, vendor contracts, engineering assessments from independent experts in the clean energy field, the patent filings for the core technology, the communication history with previous investors. What came back was a picture of a company that had, against considerable odds, maintained a level of operational integrity that was genuinely unusual for an organization under its degree of financial stress. The team had not been gutted. The core engineers who had built the prototype were still there, still working, still producing. The technology itself had been evaluated by two separate independent experts, and both had described it as technically sound, scalable with appropriate capital, and addressing a real and underserved market need. The financial records were clean, not merely clean in the sense of being compliant, but clean in the deeper sense: no unexplained transfers, no unusual payments to related parties, no gaps that suggested the kind of quiet misdirection that Victoria had learned, over years, to look for in the margins of company accounts. And there was Ethan himself. She had looked, as she always did, not just at what someone had built, but at the specific choices they had made when the building became difficult. He had sold his house 18 months ago, not as a dramatic gesture, not with any kind of announcement, but quietly, practically, because the company needed capital, and it was the capital he had available. He had reduced his own salary to the minimum sustainable level. When a competing cleantech startup had approached two of his key engineers with substantially better offers, he had not matched the offers. He couldn't, but he had been honest with them about where the company stood and what he was working toward, and both of them had stayed. One of them, when later interviewed by Victoria's research team as part of a routine reference check, had said something that she wrote down in her notes and did not forget. Ethan doesn't ask anything from us that he doesn't ask from himself first. Working for someone like that is different. It changes how you think about the work. She had read a lot of reference checks over the years. That kind of unsolicited, unscripted loyalty from an employee was rarer than most founders understood. The picture that emerged from all of it was of a man who had been doing everything right in a situation specifically designed to make doing everything right almost impossible. What he had not had, what he had never had, through all of it was the break that meant the difference between a company that survived long enough to prove itself and one that didn't. What he had also not had, though he did not know it yet, was an enemy sophisticated enough to operate from inside Titan Global. Richard Cole had been a senior vice president at the firm for 9 years. He was 61 years old, impeccably credentialed, and possessed of the kind of institutional authority that came from having been in the room for long enough that people had stopped questioning whether he deserved to be there. He had built a reputation as a rigorous evaluator of risk, cautious, thorough, someone who asked hard questions and pushed back on optimism with historical data and probability assessments. This reputation was not entirely undeserved, but it had also, over time, become a convenient mask for something more transactional. Richard had, 3 years earlier, taken a consulting arrangement with a firm called Bridgepath Energy Solutions. The arrangement was structured carefully enough to avoid any formal conflict of interest disclosures. Routed through an LLC he had established for personal investment activity, Bridgepath was a direct competitor to Green Axis in the industrial waste heat recovery space, not identical technology, not as technically advanced, but established, already deployed at 2 facilities in the Midwest, and in active negotiations with 2 other institutional investors for a Series B round that would benefit significantly from Green Axis being removed from the competitive landscape. Richard had not created this situation deliberately, at least not initially, but he had recognized it when it presented itself, and he had not chosen to recuse himself. Instead, he had shaped the internal narrative around Green Axis, from the beginning seeding the perception that Ethan was underprepared, that the technology was less advanced than claimed, that the financial situation indicated poor judgment rather than the specific kind of sacrifice that it actually represented. He had done it carefully, incrementally, through the kind of casual commentary that accumulates over time into received wisdom, and when Victoria had requested the second meeting with Ethan, Richard had understood that the situation required escalation. The escalation arrived in the form of a memo distributed to the full investment committee the morning of Ethan's second presentation. The memo bore Richard's name and was framed as a risk assessment, 12 pages of financial analysis, market comparisons, and engineering critiques that reached the conclusion, supported by selectively curated data, that Green Axis Technologies represented an unacceptable investment risk. Several of the data points in the memo were accurate. Several were subtly distorted. Several of the engineering assessments were drawn from a single source, whose independence was not disclosed, a consultant who had also performed work for Bridgepath in the previous fiscal year. The memo was not crude. It was the work of someone who understood precisely how to manufacture credibility in institutional settings, how to make what was actually a motivated argument look like dispassionate analysis. It was structured to land not as an attack, but as a caution, the reasonable voice of institutional prudence, protecting capital from an unproven founder whose idealism had outrun his operational capacity. Richard had calibrated the register carefully. Too harsh and the memo would invite scrutiny. Too measured and it would be dismissed. What he had written was precisely the thing that institutional committees respond to most readily, a warning framed as wisdom, from a voice that had been trusted for years. Victoria read it the night before the committee meeting. She read it twice. Then she called her general counsel. The independent audit that Victoria commissioned moved faster than most, because she authorized the resources for it to do so. 3 forensic accountants and 2 independent engineering consultants spent 4 days reviewing everything Green Axis's records, the claims in Richard's memo, and, once the pattern began to emerge, Richard's own financial disclosures, which were voluntary under the firm's policy but not technically mandatory. What they found in those disclosures, and in the documentation that the firm's compliance team was quietly authorized to request, was the LLC, and the connection to Bridgepath, and the consulting fee payments that had been processed in the same months during which Richard had been most actively involved in the internal assessment of Green Axis. The findings were not definitive in every detail. Some of the evidentiary threads remained circumstantial, but they were enough, more than enough. The investment committee had been scheduled to meet to review the Green Axis decision as a formality, largely on the basis of Richard's memo. Victoria moved the date up. She restructured the agenda. She sat in the room and said very little while the committee's legal team presented what the audit had produced, and watched the faces around the table as the picture assembled itself in real time in front of people who had trusted Richard's judgment for years. The meeting at which Ethan presented to the full Titan Global Investment Committee was not what he had been expecting. He had been told, by the coordinator who had confirmed the appointment, that this was a standard presentation, the final stage, before a formal decision. He had prepared accordingly. He had not been told about the audit. He had not been told about Richard. He walked into the room with his presentation and his prepared remarks and the specific, carefully maintained composure of a man who has learned to treat every important meeting as though it might be his last, and he presented for 35 minutes to a room of 11 people who listened with an attention that felt different from what he was used to, more complete, more present. When he finished, He opened the floor to questions. There were many. He answered them honestly and precisely, including the ones he didn't have complete answers to, which he flagged as areas requiring additional work rather than papering over with confident projection. He was halfway through an exchange about the regulatory environment for waste heat recovery systems when Richard interjected. His voice was smooth and steady, and projected the familiar authority of a man who had been in rooms like this one for a very long time. "I think we need to address the financial position directly," Richard said. "The company is, by any reasonable metric, approaching insolvency. The cash position as of last quarter." "That's accurate," Ethan said. He said it quietly and without defensiveness, cutting through the implication before it could settle. "We are approaching the limit of our operating runway. I don't think it helps anyone for me to pretend otherwise." A pause. The room was very still. "What I would push back on is the implication that this changes the quality of the technology or the validity of the business case. We are near broke. We are also right. Those two things can be true at the same time. I've watched a lot of good ideas die because the people behind them ran out of money before the world caught up to what they were doing. I'm asking you not to let that happen here. Not for my sake, for the sake of what this technology can actually do." He stopped, said nothing further. The room was quiet for a moment, and then another. Victoria had not planned to do what she did in the way that she did it. She had intended to present the audit findings, let the committee deliberate, and cast her vote on the basis of what the deliberation produced. She had intended to be procedural and measured, which was her default mode in institutional settings. But she had sat in that room and watched Ethan answer every question, with the kind of honesty that costs something, had watched him acknowledge his company's weakness with the same straightforwardness with which he described its strengths, and something in her had shifted past the procedural. She stood up. 11 faces turned toward her. She spoke without notes. She did not say Victoria Hayes, CEO, is pleased to inform the committee. She said, "Last month, I was standing in a bakery a few blocks from this building. I had just come from a difficult day. I was trying to buy a birthday cake for my mother. I was short." She paused the full amount. "And a man I had never met, who had also had a very difficult day, who had $3 in his wallet, put that money on the counter without being asked." She did not look at Ethan when she said it, though she was aware of him in her peripheral vision. She looked at the committee. "Not because he knew who I was," she continued. "Not because there was anything in it for him. Because it was someone else's birthday, and he thought that mattered." She paused. The room was completely silent. "We talk a great deal in this organization about investing in people. We say it in our materials. We say it to our portfolio companies. We say it to each other. Today, I would like us to actually do it." She used her veto authority on the negative votes. The resolution passed. The 12 months that followed were not easy, because the work of building a company rarely is. But they were the kind of not easy that has a direction to it, that accumulates towards something rather than simply grinding down. The $10 million from Titan Global arrived in 2 tranches, the first of which Ethan used with an almost methodical precision, paying down the accounts payable that had been aging uncomfortably, restoring his own salary to something that did not require him to calculate each grocery run, and beginning the hiring process for the 4 senior engineers, whose absence had been the single largest technical constraint on what Green Axis could build. He had been carrying those job descriptions in his head for so long that writing them out felt like transcribing something he had already memorized. The $10 million from Titan Global allowed Green Axis to hire the engineering team Ethan had been designing job descriptions for in his head for over a year. It allowed them to move from their single prototype installation to a second, then a third, then partnerships with industrial facilities across 3 states that had been watching the technology with interest since the early demos and needed only the signal of institutional backing to move from interest to commitment. There is a particular dynamic that changes around a company the moment institutional money arrives, not just the operational capacity, though that changes too, but something more intangible, the way other people in the industry begin to recalibrate their assessment of what you are and what you might become. Conversations that had stalled restarted. Facility managers who had been interested but cautious became willing to schedule site visits, then pilots, then contracts. The technology was not new. Ethan had not changed a single fundamental component of what he had been proposing for 2 years, but the world's relationship to it had shifted because the world tends to take its cues about what is serious from whoever wrote the first large check. By the end of the first year, the technology was deployed at 14 sites. Preliminary data showed energy recovery rates exceeding the projections in the original pitch by a meaningful margin. 2 national infrastructure publications ran feature pieces on green access. A government clean energy initiative reached out about a potential federal partnership. Ethan hired back 2 engineers who had left during the difficult period and brought the total team to 23 people, a number that he thought about sometimes. The simple fact of it, 23 people, showing up every day with health insurance and salaries, and the knowledge that the work they were doing would still exist next month, and felt something he had learned, over years of difficulty, to recognize as genuine. He also, during that year, became cautiously acquainted with the person who had made it possible, not in a way that was formal or professional or weighted with obligation, but in the way that sometimes happens between people who have seen each other clearly in a moment that asked for clarity. Victoria was not a warm person in the conventional sense. She was precise and direct, and did not spend words on things she did not mean. But she had, beneath the precision, a quality of attention that Ethan had noticed from the first, the sense that when she was listening to you, she was actually listening, not processing your words while composing her response, but genuinely taking in what you were saying and giving it the weight it deserved. They had coffee 3 times during the first quarter after the investment closed. Professional meetings, technically, check-ins on the company's progress. By the second quarter, the meetings had lost their strictly professional character without either of them having made a decision about that. They talked about the company, and then they talked about other things. He told her about selling the house and the period that had followed. She told him about the early years of her own career, which had been considerably harder than her current position suggested. Years of being the person in the room that certain other people in the room had decided, before she opened her mouth, was not quite the right kind of person. She had built a reputation so thorough and so well documented that it eventually became impossible to dismiss. But the work of doing so had been expensive in ways that had taken years to fully account for. The bakery had stayed open. It was a small place on the kind of block that had been slowly gentrifying for years, without quite completing the process. Original businesses next to new ones, long-time residents alongside recent arrivals, the neighborhood caught in the particular in-between of a city, always revising itself. On the afternoon of Ethan's 39th birthday, they went back. It had been Victoria's suggestion, made briefly and without ceremony in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, and he had said yes before he had finished thinking about it. They walked from their respective offices and arrived separately, and stood at the counter looking at the same display case, which had the same cupcakes in approximately the same positions, $3.25 each. Victoria ordered 2 of them, and she paid for both, and carried them to a small table near the window. They sat across from each other in the warm, buttery smell of the place, and for a few minutes they did not talk about the company or the investment or the things that were going well or the things that remained difficult. They just sat there with the small cakes in front of them, in the ordinary afternoon light. She said, "If you could go back to that day, knowing everything you know now, what happened after, would you still do it?" He thought about this for a moment, not performing thought, but actually thinking. "I didn't know you were going to be in that bakery," he said. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know any of it." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He looked at the cupcake in front of him, at the $3 price tag still visible on the case behind the counter. "Yeah," he said. "I would." She nodded, as though this was what she had expected, but had needed to hear confirmed. "Because that's who you are," she said, "not because you calculated the return on $3. He looked at her. "You were testing me again," he said, but without any heat in it. "No," she said, simply. "I was reminding myself why I made the decision I made." There are a lot of days when the decisions I make get questioned by the committee, by the market, by people who think the criteria I use are too subjective for the amounts of money involved. On those days, it helps to remember that the criteria have a foundation, that the foundation is real. A pause. Outside, the street was doing what streets do in mid-afternoon, moving, shifting. 1,000 small transactions and encounters, and moments of accidental human proximity. "Your company is going to be fine," she said. "I know. You were always going to be fine," she said. "You just needed someone to stop standing in the way." He looked out the window for a moment. "Do you know what I remember most from that day? Not the pitch. Not walking out of the building. The thing I keep coming back to is that I had $3. Not 300, not 30, 3. And I gave them away without thinking about it. And now he stopped." She waited. "I think about all the times I didn't. Not that specific day, but other days. Days when I was tired or discouraged, and someone needed something small and I calculated it." He paused. "Those $3 weren't the generous ones. Those were easy. The hard ones are when you have more than $3, and it costs more than nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. "You just articulated the entire problem with institutional investment culture," she said. He smiled at that. And she smiled too, and it was the kind of smile that contains the particular warmth of two people who have arrived at a genuine understanding of each other from a direction neither of them had anticipated. The company would go on to close a Series B round the following year, this time with multiple institutional participants who came in not reluctantly but eagerly, because the data from the first 14 deployments was now compelling enough to have passed the threshold from promising to proven. International conversations began the year after that. Facility operators in 2 European countries, a government infrastructure program in Southeast Asia, and a partnership inquiry from a Canadian energy consortium that would eventually become one of Green Axis's most productive relationships. The regulatory partnership that had been in early discussions became a formal program that put Green Axis technology in federal facilities across 7 states. Ethan spoke at 2 conferences, was profiled in an industry publication, and hired a chief operating officer so that he could return to what he was actually good at: the engineering side, the technical problem-solving, the patient, methodical work of making complex systems work in the physical world, the part of the work that had driven him to sell his house and pay himself less than his junior developer, because he believed in it completely. The apartment he had moved into after selling the house was still where he lived. He had looked at larger places during the first year after the investment, had even toured a few, but in the end he had stayed where he was, not from frugality but from a kind of deliberate continuity, the sense that the small, sparse apartment was part of the story of what had been built, and that abandoning it too quickly would be a way of pretending the difficult years hadn't mattered, when in fact they were the years he was most proud of. He never sold the idea of the $3 as a story. He never turned it into a speech or a set of talking points about the nature of opportunity or the importance of being kind to strangers, because you never know who they might be. He was somewhat allergic to that framing. In fact, the transactional version of generosity. The argument that you should be good to people because it might pay off. He had been good to a stranger on his worst day because it cost very little, and the alternative, walking past someone who needed something small, had felt worse than his circumstances justified. That was the whole of it. The rest had been, in the truest sense, someone else's decision, made freely, on the basis of something she had seen and chosen to act on. The credit was hers. The luck was his. The intersection of the two, a woman who tested what she believed against what she witnessed, a man who behaved the same when no one was watching, as when everyone was Tia, was the kind of thing that did not reduce to a lesson or a formula, but simply stood as evidence of something, that how you move through the world, in the small moments and the ordinary transactions, in the moments when nothing seems to be at stake, and the only person who can evaluate your choices is yourself, that it accumulates, that it adds up to something, not always, not reliably, not with the consistency that would allow you to plan for it. But sometimes it adds up to everything. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to the people who are carrying something important and unseen, a vision that has not yet materialized, a belief that has not yet been validated, a patience that is being asked to extend itself past what seems reasonable. It is different from ordinary loneliness, from the loneliness of isolation or estrangement. It is the loneliness of the person who is moving steadily through a world that has not yet decided to move with them, who rises every morning and does the work and makes the case and holds together the structure of what they are building, knowing that from the outside the whole thing looks like stubbornness at best and delusion at worst. Ethan had lived in that loneliness for 2 years. He had paid for it in the specific currency of the risks he had taken, and the comforts he had given up, and the quiet toll of being the person who kept believing, when the evidence for believing was growing thin. He had paid for it in the small humiliations of pitches that ended too soon, and meetings that never happened, and phone calls that went unreturned. He had paid for it in the knowledge that the people who had chosen to work for him were trusting him with something real, and that the trust was not guaranteed. What he had not known, standing in that bakery with his empty wallet and his difficult day and his instinctive reach toward a stranger's small crisis, was that the loneliness was almost over, that across the counter from him was the specific person whose attention to ordinary human decency had set her apart from nearly everyone in her position, and that she had been watching him with the full force of that attention, and that what she was seeing had changed the calculation she had made the day before, and that the calculation she made in the coming weeks would change the trajectory of something that mattered not just to him, not just to the 23 people who would eventually come to work at Green Axis, but to the residents in the neighborhoods surrounding 14 industrial sites, where clean energy now flowed through infrastructure that had previously been burning waste into the air. He had not known any of it. He had simply been, in that moment, who he was. And who he was had been enough. Not because the universe reliably rewards goodness, it does not. Not because every act of ordinary kindness generates a proportional return, it does not do that either. But because on this specific afternoon, in this specific bakery, with these specific $3, the right person had been paying attention. And attention, in the end, is its own form of grace.